In September 1922, a dentist in Newark, New Jersey, was working on a patient named Amelia Maggia. Everyone called her Molly. She was 24 years old. He was trying to extract a tooth. Instead, when he applied pressure, he lifted her jawbone out of her mouth. Not a fragment. Not a chip, her jaw. It came away in his fingers, and it had not broken. It had crumbled. She had been sick for a year by then. It began with a toothache. Then the teeth came out one by one. Then the sockets refused to heal, and filled instead with something that oozed and would not stop. The infection ate through the bone of her lower jaw, then the upper. It reached her throat. On the 12th of September, it opened an artery, and Molly Maggia bled to death in her bed. The doctor who signed her death certificate wrote down a cause. He did not write bone necrosis. He did not write poisoning. He wrote that Molly Maggia had died of syphilis. That word would follow her, and every woman who worked beside her, for the next 6 years. It was not a mistake. It was a strategy. And the company that employed her had by that point been holding the real answer in a filing cabinet for at least 4 years. To understand what happened to Molly Maggia, you have to understand how the world felt about radium in 1917. Marie and Pierre Curie had isolated it in 1898 in a shed in Paris out of tons of pitchblende ore. What they had was a substance 1,000,000 times more radioactive than uranium, and it did something no other element in a chemist's cabinet did. It glowed, not by reflecting light. On its own, in the dark, faintly and continuously, apparently forever. Nobody in 1917 understood what that glow was. They understood what it looked like: vitality, energy, life itself, made visible. And the market responded exactly the way you would expect a market to respond to bottled life. Radium went into everything: toothpaste, so your smile would gleam, face cream, bath salts, chocolate, suppositories, a patented water called Radithor, sold as a general tonic, which was simply radium dissolved in water, and which was, unlike most of the quack products, exactly what it claimed to be. Doctors prescribed radium for arthritis, for gout, for high blood pressure, for impotence. A gram cost more than $100,000 in today's money, which only confirmed to the buying public that it must be powerful. And then there was the paint. Mix radium salts with zinc sulfide and a binder, and you get a compound that glows greenish-white in the dark, without any power source. A man named Sabin von Sochocki patented a version of it and gave it a brand name, Undark. In 1917, the United States entered the First World War, and Undark stopped being a novelty and became a strategic material. A soldier in a trench at night cannot strike a match to read his watch. A pilot cannot light his instrument panel without blinding himself. An artillery officer needs to read a compass in the dark. Suddenly, the American military needed millions of luminous dials, and it needed them fast. Von Sochocki's company, soon renamed the United States Radium Corporation, set up a studio in a former silk mill in Orange, New Jersey. A competitor, the Radium Dial Company, set up in a converted high school in Ottawa, Illinois. They needed workers with steady hands, fine motor control, and patience. They hired young women. Many were teenagers. The youngest were 11. The pay was extraordinary. A dial painter working on piece rate could earn 3 times what she'd make in a factory or a laundry, enough that the job was considered a plum, passed between sisters and cousins and best friends. Whole streets in Orange sent their daughters. In Ottawa, the studio was full of girls who had gone to school in that same building. The work required a line finer than a hair. The numerals on a wristwatch dial are tiny, and the paint had to sit precisely inside them. A camel hair brush loses its point after a few strokes, so the women were taught a technique for repointing it. They were taught it on their first day, by their supervisors, as the correct way to do the job. Put the brush between your lips, twist, dip it in the paint the numeral, then do it again. Lip, dip, paint, 250 dials a day, every one of them meaning another mouthful of radium. Some of the women asked whether the stuff was harmful. They were told it was not. One later remembered being told that if she swallowed some, it would put roses in her cheeks. Given everything the newspapers and the drugstores were saying about radium in 1918, the answer was not even implausible. So they played with it. Of course they did. They were 19, and they worked in a room full of glowing dust that got into everything: their hair, their eyelashes, the fabric of their skirts. They painted their fingernails with it. They painted their teeth before a date, so their smile would flash in a dark theater. They wore their good dresses to work so the powder would settle in the weave and they'd glow on the walk home. In Orange, people started calling them the ghost girls. They would come out of the mill at the end of a shift, and in the winter dark you could see them coming. The women were told and believed that they were the luckiest girls in New Jersey. Here is the part that decides whether this is a tragedy or a crime. Radium's capacity to destroy living tissue was not a mystery in 1917. It was the entire basis of a medical industry. Pierre Curie had deliberately strapped a sample to his own arm and documented the wound it burned. Henri Becquerel had carried a vial in his waistcoat pocket and been burned through his clothing. Doctors were already using radium to burn out tumors, which requires knowing, precisely, that it burns out tissue. And inside the United States Radium Corporation, that knowledge was visible in the layout of the building. In the laboratories upstairs, where the chemists worked, radium was handled with lead screens between the material and the body. It was moved with ivory-tipped tongs, never bare hands. Staff wore lead aprons. Sabin von Sochocki, the man who invented the paint, had already lost a fingertip to it. Downstairs in the studio, the women held the brushes in their mouths. There was no screen, no apron, no tongs, and no warning. The company's own scientific staff took precautions that the company's own instructions to its workers made impossible. The two facts sat one floor apart in the same building for years. By 1925, the Radium Dial Company in Illinois had gone further. It had its own workers medically tested and got back results showing abnormalities in their blood. It did not tell them the results. What it did instead, when rumors started circulating in Ottawa, was take out an advertisement in the local newspaper stating that nothing in the plant was harmful to the girl's health. This is the pattern that will repeat in every episode of this series, and it is worth naming plainly at the start. The cover-up is almost never the invention of a lie out of nothing. It is the maintenance of a comfortable answer after the true answer has already arrived, in writing, on someone's desk. Molly Maggia was not the first, and she was very far from the last. The pattern was always the same, and it always started in the mouth. Radium is a bone seeker. Chemically, it behaves almost exactly like calcium, which means the body, encountering it, does the worst possible thing. It files it away in the skeleton, as if it were nutrition. And there it stays. Radium-226 has a half-life of about 1600 years. There is no course of treatment. There is no flushing it out. Every one of those women was, from her first week on the job, carrying a source inside her own bones that would keep firing for longer than the Roman Empire lasted. It ate the jaw first, because the jaw took the biggest dose. Dentists in Newark and Ottawa began seeing something they had never seen before and could not name. Young women whose jawbones were dissolving, whose extraction sites would not close, who developed abscesses that no drainage would clear. In 1924, a New York dentist, Theodore Blum, published a note describing a case of what he called radium jaw. It was the first time the cause appeared in print. Then came the anemia, as the radiation destroyed the bone marrow. Then the fractures, hips and spines snapping under the weight of ordinary walking because the bone had been hollowed out from inside. Then the tumors, sarcomas the size of grapefruit growing off the pelvis and the femur. One woman's leg shortened by inches as her hip disintegrated. Another's spine collapsed until she could no longer sit upright. They were in their 20s. The company's response was not silence. Silence would have been passive. The response was active, and it had three parts. First, buy the science. U.S. Radium commissioned studies. When findings came back linking the paint to the illnesses, they were not published. One report was reportedly issued under a different investigator's name, its conclusions reversed. Second, reassure the sick. A Columbia University physiologist named Frederick Flynn, who was not a medical doctor and who was on the company's payroll, though the women were not told either fact, examined dying dial painters and told them there was nothing wrong with them. He published a paper in 1926 stating that the industry had no case of occupational poisoning. Third, name the disease something shameful, syphilis. It was written on Molly Maggia's death certificate, and it was whispered around Orange for years afterward. It was a near-perfect instrument. Syphilis can cause bone damage, so it was medically arguable. It killed sympathy for the victims. It cost the women their reputations, their engagements, their standing in a Catholic immigrant community, and it made them reluctant to speak, which was the actual purpose. Grace Fryer had worked in the Orange studio from 1917 to 1920. Her teeth began coming loose in 1922. Her jaw began breaking down. Eventually, she needed a steel back brace to hold her spine upright. She decided to sue. It took her 2 years to find a lawyer who would take the case. 2 years. The obstacles were structural, not incidental. New Jersey's workers' compensation law at the time carried a 5-month filing deadline from the date of injury, and radium poisoning takes years to present, which meant that by the time any dial painter knew she had been poisoned, her legal right to complain had expired. There was no established category for this. There was no precedent for a worker suing an employer for a disease contracted at work, and the defendant was a corporation with money, chemists, and lawyers, being sued by unemployed women who could not walk unassisted. In 1927, a young attorney named Raymond Berry took it on. 5 women signed as plaintiffs: Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and the sisters Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice. The New Jersey papers named them the Radium Girls. What broke the case open was measurement. A county physician named Harrison Martland had been developing a way to detect radium inside a living person, measuring the radioactive gas in their exhaled breath and the gamma radiation coming off their bones. The bodies of these women were emitting a signal. It could be recorded on an instrument. It could be put in front of a jury. And in 1927, Molly Maggia was exhumed. 5 years in the ground. Her remains were still radioactive. Photographic plates placed against her bones exposed themselves in the dark. The syphilis line on her death certificate had been, in the most literal available sense, disproved by her own skeleton. The defense strategy in court was delay. It was not subtle, and it did not need to be. Hearings were pushed, adjournments requested, dates moved into the following term, while the plaintiff's own physicians testified that none of the 5 was expected to live out the year. Every postponement was worth money, because a dead plaintiff is a cheaper plaintiff. In June 1928, with the case drawing national coverage and a federal judge pushing both sides toward mediation, U.S. Radium settled. Each woman received a lump sum of $10,000, an annual payment of $600 for as long as she lived, and her medical costs. The company admitted no liability. Grace Fryer died in 1933. She was 34. The New Jersey settlement did not end the practice. 900 miles west, in Ottawa, Illinois, the Radium Dial Company was still running, still using the lip-pointing technique, and still telling its workers the paint was harmless. Catherine Wolfe Donahue had started there as a teenager. By the mid-1930s, she was limping, then unable to work, then unable to stand. Her hip was disintegrating. She weighed 71 pounds. She had been fired from the studio when she became visibly ill, and her employer's position was that whatever was wrong with her had nothing to do with them. Ottawa was a company town, and the social pressure ran in the company's favor. Some of the sick women were treated as troublemakers or as embarrassments. Donahue and a small group of others, they called themselves the Society of the Living Dead, sued anyway, in front of the Illinois Industrial Commission in 1938. She could not get to the hearing. The final sessions were held in the front room of her own house, with the commission, the lawyers, and the press crowded around her bed. She testified lying down, holding pieces of her own jawbone that had come out in her hand, wrapped in a handkerchief, and entered them into evidence. She won. And then the appeal started. The company appealed the ruling 8 times, through the state system and upward. In October 1939, the Supreme Court of the United States declined to hear it, and the judgment finally stood. Catherine Donahue had died in July 1938, before any of that. Her award, when it was finally paid, came to a little over $5,500. It would be neater to end on the injustice, but the reason this case is remembered is that it did not only produce corpses, it produced law, and it produced instruments. The dial painter's litigation helped establish something that had not existed in American law: the principle that a worker could hold an employer liable for a disease contracted through the work, even when the disease surfaced years after the exposure. Statutes of limitation for occupational illness were rewritten. Several states extended compensation coverage to industrial disease as a direct consequence of these cases. Martlin's measurement techniques became the foundation of a field. When the United States began building nuclear weapons a decade later, the people setting safe internal exposure limits for tens of thousands of Manhattan Project workers were working from data generated by the dial painters' bodies. A physicist at MIT, Robley Evans, spent decades tracking the surviving women, the first long-term human study of the effects of an internal radioactive emitter. Those numbers went into the radiation protection standards that still exist. Luminous dial work did not stop. Radium was still being painted onto instruments through the Second World War at far larger scale for aircraft, but the technique had changed. Brushes were not pointed with the mouth. There were exhaust hoods, monitoring, protective equipment, and rules, and the World War II cohort did not die the way the World War I cohort did. The protections worked. That is the measure of what the earlier deaths were. Not inevitable, not the unavoidable cost of a young technology. Preventable, by measures that existed at the time and were used upstairs. The contamination outlasted everyone involved. The Ottawa and Orange sites required decades of federal environmental remediation, buildings demolished, soil hauled away by the ton, work continuing into the 1990s and beyond. And the women are still radioactive. Radium-226 does not care that the lawsuits are settled or that the companies are dissolved. Its half-life is 1,600 years. The dial painters were buried in ordinary cemeteries in New Jersey and Illinois, in ordinary graves, and the isotope filed into their bones in 1918 has completed a rounding error of its decay. Researchers have taken instruments into those cemeteries and read the signal coming up through the soil. That is the physical record, but it is not the only thing that survived. What survived was the paperwork, the commission study that was never published, the 1925 test results that were never disclosed. The newspaper advertisement assuring the girls of Ottawa that nothing in that building could hurt them. The lead aprons requisitioned for one floor and not the other. Everything anyone needed to know was written down before the first woman died. It was written down, filed, and kept.